thank you, Senator Aubrey McCarthy.
Thanks a million, and thank you all for being here today. And I wear a similar hat to Éireann and Brian in that I'm involved in an AHB that deals specifically with people that come from a cohort of addiction and homelessness. And today's all about unlocking the barriers to housing delivery. But I think it's also important that we understand how the barriers, how they actually affect the affordability of homes that are ultimately delivered. And I know Deputy Aubrey was talking beforehand, and Deputy Éireann, about how affordability is key. I'm involved in an LDA project in Bluebell, and we had a consultation, and we found that cost rental is not very, it's difficult, and affordable housing is not very affordable. So things are changing and the goalposts are changing. And even on this committee, I've tried to focus on how can we build homes, how can we deliver homes that ordinary working households can afford or indeed rent. And even last week we had the Housing Activation Office in here, and they spoke about the importance of the coordination between agencies. So we were dealing with a start in Kildare, and yet we had the activation symposium, land activation symposium conference, and yet the Department of Education weren't part of that. So it was all moving ahead, but yet the school's education wasn't part of that. So it seems like there's a disconnect between the agencies. So my first question is for Conor. And it's how much of today's the actual housing challenge is a shortage of the physical infrastructure and investment, and how much is a problem because of process, because of delays, red tape, inertia in the system?
I'll take the last bit of that two-part question first, and thanks very much for the question, Senator. I think, look, timelines for planning, as you rightly point out, are a cost factor. I think there's a significant call now for resources at local authority level. I think they need to be resourced better, both engineers and planners, they have to deal with now the variation process, moving to a 10-year development plan. They have to deal with, hopefully, over the next number of months, an increase in planning applications on that zoned land. They're going to have to deal with taking in charge of estates. They're going to have to deal with, for a typical 250 home development, you've got 1,000 pages of reports that have to be read by a planner at a local authority level. And then we're talking about the implementation of national policy at a local level. So it's vital that if we are to reduce those timelines, bring about greater affordability, that resourcing is allocated to the local authority sector.
But Conor, last week or the week before, we had the MEPs in, we had the Housing Committee from the European Parliament, and what they did, they said that Ireland is an outlier. Our comparison in Europe is not the same. We all operate under the same housing laws, under the same EU legislation, and yet Ireland is an outlier regarding delays. We can't get it right, and they expressed frustration at that.
No, and I think that's a fair comment. I think, look, over the last number of years, 36 months was referenced earlier on by one builder, which is an extraordinary period of time to bring forward land to a development stage. Look, the infrastructure unit and the report to the infrastructure unit is going to be vital, and that's why we're all talking about here today the implementation of that infrastructure unit report to bring about a reduction in the regulatory framework around delivering houses and building them.
Can you see that happening?
We do. We see the beginning of it. We look forward to, the implementation and the reduction, maybe, for example, an expansion of a wastewater treatment plant. Why can't you expand or put in an extra treatment pod within that plant that, once it doesn't go beyond the curtilage or the height of the existing plant, why do you need planning permission for that? There's a whole range of exemptions that could be introduced for the expansion of infrastructure. Can we use, for instance, the Part 8 planning process where the local authority councillors vote? Can we use that process to deliver the roads that were in the 86 projects announced today as part of the Housing Infrastructure Fund? So there is a lot that's in the mix at the moment that implemented could reduce those timelines. But it does come down to resourcing as well in many different ways.
Just another question for Michael Stanley there. Michael, you mentioned there, and you mentioned in the open statement about the housing deficit, and you mentioned the importance of apartments. And you mentioned that many times in the opening statement. So I'm just wondering, what in your view are the type of homes that we need to focus on? And also, from what I'm hearing from previous witnesses here, is that apartments cannot be built without subsidies. They don't make sense from a cost point of view.
Well, hopefully you'll have heard some more positive things about apartment development, not just today, but the previous time we were in. As I said earlier, apartment output increased by close to 40% last year.
But who's buying them? Is the state buying them?
No, well, the state, in some cases, if it's an affordable housing association, may be acquiring. It could be equally the LDA, it could be equally a local authority, it could equally be private purchasers. We are selling schemes to private purchasers as well, some of them supported by Croí Cónaí. We'll be launching a very large private purchase scheme for private owners this weekend in Seven Mills, where we'll be hopefully successful in selling very large quantities of private apartments to customers who will be buying those apartments at price levels between 250 and up to high 300s, similar to the type of price points that Stephen mentioned. So the industry is starting to deliver value. It's only the start of the process, because we need to be able to deliver lots of homes at those price points. But I think the apartment challenge, it's really important, I think, to say to the Commission today that when it comes to our National Development Plan, we as an industry have to respond to policy, to government policy, to policy driven by this committee, including land use and land density. And there is a reality that nobody seems to fully acknowledge, that not only do we designate land use in Ireland through our National Development Plan in terms of what it's used for, i.e. what land is zoned residential, but we are also given density targets in that land.
Mm-hmm. So can I just ask...
Just to finish the point. So 80% of development land that exists today that hasn't been built on the eastern seaboard of Ireland and in Galway and in Cork has a density target that we must hit of between 20 and 100 units per hectare. That means 80% of development land that's left to build in Ireland today must have either an element, significant element, or all apartments. If it's within a kilometre of a rail line or a bus corridor, it has to be all apartments. And
that's my point. So are apartments, does it make sense to build apartments without subsidies, without the state buying them?
In some cases, yes.
Do you know what percentage?
Well, I think it's certainly improving. And I think when we see, the implementation of other changes in terms of the types of apartments that we design, but private apartments are re-emerging.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just my last question here is just the, well, I have two parts of it. Section 28 guidelines were given last July. Are you confident that the local authorities have taken the ball and run regarding Section 28 guidelines? And also something that was mentioned last week in here was, if you have a planning decision in one local authority and it is accepted or whatever, allowed, in another local authority that's neighbouring, the same planning decision would not be. So it all depends on the person's specific
David
plan.
is probably the expert here in the room on this.
So Section 28 and then the plan.
Pass the ball. World Cup parlance. We'll hand one over to you there, David.
Yeah, you're still using football analogies. That's the definition of a hospital pass, if anyone's wondering. So in terms of your first query, Senator, in respect to the Section 28 guidelines, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest with you. Conor touched on it earlier on. I think it's 18 months since those Section 28 guidelines came out. Probably 17 of the local authorities have completed the variation process, meaning 14 haven't. So there's still work to be done on that piece. And I suppose there are lessons to be learned out of that process that we should take on board for future variations, or indeed for development plans into the future. And that's around a standardised methodology. You spoke in your second question around kind of diverging approaches of local authorities. I would argue there was also diverging approaches of local authorities as it related to the Section 28 guidelines. So that kind of inconsistent methodology means it's very, very difficult for us as an industry to understand what the output of those Section 28 guidelines are going to be.
So is there an argument then, David, that planning should be taken away from the local authorities?
No, I wouldn't go that far, but I think there has to be, I would maybe advocate for an increased role of the planning regulator, the department, around ensuring that there's more consistent approaches to how planning authorities deal with development plan making processes, or indeed, to your second point, the divergence of decision making processes. And I think that second point is actually critical, because
Okay, David, if you don't mind, we're well over time. Conor, you just want to come in briefly on this point, I think.
Very briefly. And this is not, it is partly defence of local authorities, but we've also seen situations where there's been very tight voting when it comes to the variation process in local authority council chambers, and there is a role for the councillors as well at local authority level to support national policy in relation to the variation process and housing targets. And just to also make the point as well, Chairman, that there's also been other state agencies that have written in as part of the variation process, and some of the comments from some of those state agencies has been completely unhelpful towards the variation process to achieve the housing targets.
Michael, did you want to brief?
Just a quick point, and that is the local authorities, we're in silos, which is what we need to break down, because when the local authorities had the services taken away from them, you had Irish Water doing their own thing, utilities doing their own thing. There needs to be a coordinated approach where actually if the local authority are zoning the land, the actually infrastructural providers need to row in behind that and actually put their capital programme to bear that it's actually developing the infrastructure on time. And I suppose the other point is, to Michael's point, on densities, the reality is we're actually straitjacketed on densities, and it won't work in most of regional Ireland departments, and we should re-look at that.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Very briefly, Mike.
Reference our submission, I'd really welcome to read what we said about transport-orientated development, because that is part of our national development plan. And it's why we today wanted to highlight the importance of multimodal transport links, of electrifying rail lines, of the DART Plus projects and other projects in our cities, because it's been a proven fact internationally that if you provide public transport, particularly rapid rail public transport, it is a massive enabler to housing development and making housing and apartments more affordable.
Okay.
Just wanted to add that point.
Perfect. I need to move on. So